My lords, only representative reporting, designation, Red King, Senior Commander, Admiral Osman. Today I shall report on 5 of the most horrific events that have occurred in our galaxy. I hope you find this illuminating. We begin with the Unggoy Rebellion, also known as the Grunt Rebellion. The Grunt Rebellion is a notable chapter in the complex tapestry of Covenant history. It represents a surprising and somewhat clandestine shift in the dynamics of the Covenant, typically known for its authoritarian structure and the strict adherence of its various species to the religious tenets dictated by the prophets. The Grunts are often dismissed as the lowest ranking members of the Covenant. They were, and indeed are still, commonly perceived as comic relief or cannon fodder on the battlefield. Their discontent festered in the shadows, away from the watchful eyes of the prophets and other Covenant leaders. In the year 2462, a rebellion occurred. Events began with what would later be called the Infusion Incident. The exploding Grunt population had begun to put pressure on the Kig Ya, also known as the Jackals, with whom they shared their habitats. This overwhelming Grunt population increase began to force many of the Jackals to relocate. This mass migration resulted in the destruction of many jackal egg hatcheries, causing their birth rate to decline significantly. In an effort to extract revenge, elements of the Jackal's hierarchy conducted and carried out a plan to poison the Grunt infusion resources. These were recreational narcotics used in the Grunt's portable methane supplies. This contamination made the male Grunts sterile, and led to further escalation between the two species. The prophets initially failed to respond to this escalation, and the Grunts and Jackals began a full-scale war against one another. Repeated attempts to cease hostilities were ignored, and the Covenant High Council sent an arbiter to resolve the situation. The conflict ended only when the Grunt homeworld was almost completely glassed by a Covenant fleet. Billions of Grunts were dead. However, the war showed that when motivated, the Grunts could be vicious, determined, and competent fighters. Following the warrior tradition, the Sanghili, also known as the Elites, who had defeated the uprising, forgave the surviving Grunts, trained them, gave them better equipment, and allowed them access to weapons, which the Grunts had previously been forbidden to have. They then began to be integrated into elite units, elevating them from unarmed cannon fodder to true infantry forces. Despite this, they are ultimately kept at a low rank in the Covenant. On to number 4, the Spartan II Program. The Spartan II Program was a continuation of Project Orion. In the late 25th century, during times of human insurrection, the Office of Naval Intelligence launched Project Orion. This project was launched in secret with the goal to create a genetically enhanced and mechanically augmented super soldier, and to deploy these soldiers behind enemy lines where they would quell insurgencies in their infancy, or neutralize established insurgencies by destroying the chain of command. This project was headquartered in one of the many docks on Reach, and the candidates were, once again, selected volunteers from all special force branches of the military. Though the Orion super soldiers were effective, their abilities fell short of the scientists' hopes, and they cost far too much to develop and field. This, among other reasons, caused the cancellation of the Orion project, and the 165 surviving Orion super soldiers returned to active duty. The insurrectionists and attacks, however, did not disappear, and the Spartan II project was conceived by Dr. Halsey of ONI's Section 3 as the successor to the original Orion project, and the best possible solution to end the conflict with the insurrectionists. Establishing a rigorous genetic criteria to screen potential candidates, Dr. Halsey identified 150 children for the program, but ONI would only give her enough funding to train 75. Thus, Dr. Halsey made arrangements to meet each of the candidates in order to determine who her 75 candidates would be. At her request, Junior Lieutenant Jacob Keyes accompanied her during the interview of Spartan John 117. Upon choosing her candidates, she then had the children abducted from their homes and brought to the planet Reach for training. The recruited children were replaced by Flash clones, which sadly died within a few years from various neurological and physiological diseases due to complications arising from the unperfected Flash cloning process. These stolen children were indoctrinated into the military, brutally trained, and then augmented, with only 33 surviving the procedures to reshape them into the legendary Spartans they would become. Number 3. The Spartan III Program. Unlike the Spartan IIs, who were initially created with the goal to fight insurrectionists and rebellions, the Spartan IIIs were created post-Covenant contact, and it's important to note that humanity was losing the war. As the Human Covenant War progressed and casualties mounted exponentially, only activated another program that was even more morally questionable than the Spartan II Program. Spearheaded by a prominent opposition to Dr. Halsey's Spartan II Program, Colonel James Ackerson, the Spartan IIIs were designed to be produced more quickly, at a lower cost, and with a lower life expectancy. The Spartan III Program was intended for extremely high-risk operations, conducted at the highest level of secrecy. The Spartan candidates were once again children, aged between 4 and 6 years old. This time, however, they were orphans who had lost their homes and families due to Covenant invasions. The Spartan III candidates were taken to the planet Onyx and placed under the leadership of Lieutenant Commander Kurt Ambrose. Throughout the Human Covenant War, 3 companies of Spartan IIIs were trained, deployed, and largely wiped out in their entirety. The first company of Spartan IIIs, Alpha Company, consisted of 497 trainees, of which 300 became Spartans. They were successful in destroying Covenant and Rebel forces during the battles of Manamore, New Constantinople, and in the Bonanza asteroid belt. Their last mission, Operation Prometheus, in 2537 was deemed a success. However, all of the Spartans in Alpha Company were killed in action. The second company, Beta Company, a further 300 Spartans, trained soon after the loss of Alpha Company. They carried out their first mission, Operation Torpedo, in 2545, which was also deemed a success, despite the fact that only 2 Spartan IIIs, Tom and Lucy, survived out of the original 300 that took part in the operation. Tom and Lucy went on to train the third company of Spartan IIIs. By the time the third company of Spartan IIIs had completed their augmentation, many were deployed on missions elsewhere during the final years of the war, when the shield world on Onyx was activated. Several teams of Spartan IIIs survived the Battle of Onyx, and ended up being trapped within the shield world with Spartan II's Blue Team. Despite the overall effectiveness of the Spartan III program, what happened to these children is regrettable. Number 2. The Flood. I'm sure many of the educated among you may have expected the Flood to be at number 1 on this list. If you can make it to the end, you'll find out why they aren't. The Flood are an ancient parasitic entity that consumes sentient life. The Flood is relentless, adaptive, and has the ability to assimilate both organic and artificial forms into its biomass. The Flood's history is complicated. We believe that they were born from something called precursor dust, the remnants of the precursors. The precursors are, however, worthy of an entire report in themselves. While possessing an unusual sentient intelligence, with combat forms still retaining extremely high-level cognitive functions, such as vehicular operation, traits such as dexterity and complex battlefield tactics are notably lacking in the Flood, especially in their psychological and combat behaviour. While the Gravemind coordinates the Flood strategy on a galactic scale, small encounters are not coordinated between individual Flood warriors. As such, the Flood strategy is quite simple. They throw themselves at potential hosts in huge numbers, with any and all weapons available. Flood tactics are based primarily on asymmetrical warfare. The Flood uses all of its different forms to kill any enemy it sees. Infection forms swarm across the battlefield in waves, reanimating any corpses they find, while combat forms attack and kill hosts on sight. Pure forms, if present, provide support to combat forms in a number of ways. Stalker forms move to strategic positions and mutate into either tank or range forms and attempt to destroy enemy armor or fortifications, or providing suppressing fire from afar. The Flood's millennia of existence has made the assimilation process extremely brief. Hosts killed in a short firefight can be reanimated within seconds to minutes by an infection form, and live creatures can be mutated into fully developed combat forms within the same time frame. Modern humanity first encountered the Flood during the Battle of Apex. The human ship UNSC Spirit of Fire jumped from Arcadia to follow the signal of Professor Anders, who had been captured by the Covenant. They were led to an unknown planet, which happened to be a forerunner shield world. Containment measures on this planet had failed catastrophically, and the entire surface of the planet was choked with Flood biomass. Ground forces were deployed to investigate the presence of unknown hostiles, sighted by the ship's radar. After fighting their way through Covenant forces, Sergeant Forge and several Marine squads were attacked by the Flood. The Spirit of Fire was ultimately lost with all hands. Our second encounter involves the events of Installation 04, the first Halo ring we discovered. Captain Keyes thought he had discovered an ancient weapons cache. It turned out to be a research facility. The Flood were released and began to multiply rapidly. The Flood on Installation 4 were eventually defeated, at the cost of many lives and the destruction of the installation. Several notable humans were infected. 2, however, were quite interesting. Firstly, Wallace Jenkins, who was one of the Marines accompanying Captain Keyes in the original mission to the supposed arms cache, was infected by a weak and elderly infection form, whose powers of infection had been dulled by years of hibernation. This made Jenkins' transformation into a combat form incomplete. Jenkins was still able to resist the persuasive Flood entity in his mind, and although incapable of articulating speech properly, Jenkins was still able to betray the Flood through hand gestures during an interrogation with Major Antonio Silva, informing the UNSC Marine Battalion that the Flood planned to assault the UNSC base from a series of underground catacombs. In response to this intelligence, the UNSC moved to secure them and prevented the Flood from staging another attack. Sergeant Johnson was also among the same team as Watkins and Keyes, and he was also infected, but he was able to shrug off the effects due to the complications of Borin's syndrome. Borin's syndrome was a fabricated human disease contrived by Oni to cover up the Orion project, which would later be known as the original Spartan I Program. So to connect the dots, Sergeant Johnson was part of the Orion project and was in fact Spartan I. And finally, in at number 1, the most horrific thing to have occurred in our galaxy pertains to the events that occurred at Site 22. In the year 2556, workers at the Ebrium Machine Complex and BXR Mining Corporation, based out of LV, habitat and corporate campus on LV-31, a nearby asteroid, discovered the buried Forerunner starship at Site 22. To access the find, BXR Mining Corporation bored a hole through the asteroid's grey-brown crust using EM-120 augers. At this point, it was up to the IMC Hazmat Corps to investigate further. Upon approach, the vessel opened to admit the Hazmat team. Shortly after entering the Forerunner vessel, the team was attacked by the Flood, who quickly dispatched and infected the team, turning them into attacker forms. The Flood poured forth, escaping the mouth of the newly formed cave leading to the ship. From here, the Flood began to infect other IMC and BXR personnel at the site. Upon losing contact with the ground team and receiving confirmation of the Flood's presence at Site 22, a Captain Pedro Alvarez of the UNSC Saturn decided to deploy Fireteam Leviathan, a Spartan Flood containment unit, to clear out the infestation rather than simply destroying the site from orbit. Captain Alvarez cited the UNSC Holmes fleet need for the site's resources and the asteroid's proximity to the inhabited LV-31 as reason enough to not destroy the asteroid with a Shiva-class nuclear missile. I have a direct account of events I shall detail for you now. Julian was pretty sure that he hadn't been infected yet, but nevertheless he felt like his memories were becoming scrambled, just the same as he watched UNSC forces descend on Site 22 like they were dropping in behind Covenant lines. He made out a squadron of Cyclops exoskeletons and several Hellbringer units as they began to torch the area indiscriminately, every bit as likely to incinerate other survivors to deny the enemy any potential hosts from beyond the perimeter. The magnitude of the initial find had necessitated a larger than normal contingent of staff assigned to Site 22. It meant that there had been ample opportunity for the parasite to satiate its appetite and rapidly increase its own numbers in the same time it had taken for the UNSC to deploy. Not that it had taken long, but it almost seemed too late now. Julian grimaced. His sidearms ammunition had run dry, forcing him to resort to a nearby laser cutter. Glancing around, he felt the cold grip of dismay. He didn't know what he'd use after the cutter's charge was gone, and there weren't many other viable options. But that's when he saw them. Myths, legends, Spartans. UNSC had seen fit to send a fire team of 4 chemically and cybernetically augmented super soldiers, heroes that helped ensure the end of the Covenant War, heroes that their greatest enemies had feared. At that moment, Julian was struck by the dire enormity of the situation at Site 22. There was no way that Spartans would be sent into any scenario where normal, everyday people were remotely expected to survive. The battle raged on, and Julian's heat seals constantly spiking to their maximum levels from the constant barrage of flame and firepower being brought to bear by the Hellbringers and Cyclops units. For a fleeting moment, he thought that he might actually have a chance. This nightmare was something he may wake up from. But then the first Spartan fell. Overrun by the parasite, one of the UNSC's living weapons suddenly found itself undergoing a new augmentation, twisted into a champion of dormant darkness. The Spartan's armor attempted to enact countermeasures, pressurizing the hydrostatic gel layer to render itself immobile, and then detonating micro-explosives within the helmet, shattering the Spartan's visor as it immolated its head. And yet, it still wasn't enough. Julian wanted to run, to cry, to hide, but he could not move. He could not tear himself away from the sight of a Spartan turning on its own kind. He could not stop watching in horror as it tore apart those it had once protected. And then, the visor turned towards him. Despite the team being backed up by Cyclops and Hellbringers, the Spartans ultimately fell to the parasite, forcing Captain Alvarez to declare the Corruptor and Upsilon protocols. All personnel on site were given 7 minutes to evacuate before bombardment from the ship's weapons commenced. Only a handful of dropships managed to flee Site 22 before it was utterly obliterated. Never before had a Spartan been infected with the parasite until now. Truly terrifying. Thanks for watching, folks. If you want to hear me narrate the entirety of the Site 22 story, please let me know in the comments. And if you want to hear more from me, please click the video on screen now.